Fuller, welcome to Scratching the Surface. Over the last few years, I have grown increasingly frustrated with the term human-centered design. On one hand, it seemed to reinforce a human supremacy view of the world while ignoring all the other non-human life around it. I've wondered what something like ecology-centered design, for example, might look like, or if that is some sort of better goal for us to work towards. On the other hand, I've come to believe that a lot of what we call human-centered isn't really human-centered at all, but rather corporation-centered, designed for increasing profits and maximizing attention. I found myself reflecting on these ideas often while reading James Bridle's fascinating new book, Ways of Being: Animals, Plants, Machines, and the Search for Planetary Intelligence. James' book is not about design, necessarily. I'm not sure they ever even use the term human-centered in the text, but it speaks brilliantly and articulately on the nature of intelligence in the more-than-human world. In the book, James takes us on a wide-ranging tour of the natural world to redefine intelligence, arguing that our current definitions are limited and therefore also limiting our understandings of technology, artificial intelligence, and the built world at large. Like my own thinking on corporation-centered design, for example, James argues that much of what we call artificial intelligence can be seen as a type of corporate intelligence that prioritizes the bottom line, maximizing profits, and markets over all else. It's one of my favorite books of the year. I've been following James's work for the better part of a decade. They are an artist, a writer, and a technologist whose work explores technology, infrastructure, networks, and politics. Their last book, The New Dark Age, is a book that broadly is about the internet and the increasingly complex networks that surround us. They've exhibited artworks around the world and has written for publications like Wired, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. James is an artist and a thinker who I've admired for years, and after reading Ways of Being, wanted to have them on the show to talk through both the ideas in the book as well as their practice generally. We also talk about these thoughts on human-centered design. We talk about design fictions and why they see their work as being primarily about agency. It's an inspiring, fascinating, and profound conversation. As always, links from the references we talk about in this episode are available at scratchingthesurface.com. And if you like the show and want to support its ongoing development, you can join us on Patreon for as low as $3 a month. Patrons help keep the show going and get all sorts of bonus content each month. We really couldn't do it without you. Thank you for listening, and here is my conversation with James Bridle. I want to talk about the ideas in your new book, Ways of Being, but I have a question before that where I want to sort of just contextualize it a little bit. I was listening to an interview that you gave right after the book came out, and you said that you pitched this to your publishers as a book about intelligence. You're interested in this idea of intelligence, and then in the writing process, you sort of had this challenge in defining intelligence. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where that interest came from, or what that sort of initial impulse to think about this idea of intelligence. What was the sort of driving, animating force when you started this project?
So in the last few years, I've made a few projects about artificial intelligence. And like pretty much everyone else, I've been aware of this sort of growing cultural fascination with AI. It's been around for a very long time. It's a really powerful, but mostly science fictional concept. But it's now gone very, very much mainstream. And like a lot of the subjects around technology, I tend to be very interested in. It's both the popular discussion of it is quite divorced from the actual mechanics of the technology. So when people talk about AI, it's often quite hard, or it takes a while to figure out, are they talking about an actually existing software that we have and use, or are they talking about some kind of science fiction idea of this thing? And I'm always interested in that difference. And I'm also always interested in what happens when things that have previously been science fiction sort of crash into real life and become boring almost instantly. And what sort of discussions happen around that? Who decides what this thing actually is when it becomes real? This happened a lot with projects I did that are related to the AI question around
Right.
self-driving cars. This kind of strange moment when something we've been waiting for so long is suddenly real, but not always quite in the way that we expected. And so I had this fascination with AI, and at the same time, I was, you know, I found myself reading and researching a huge amount about non-human intelligence and
Mhm.
the incredible discoveries or kind of realizations is a better way to put it of the abilities of non-humans that really challenge our ideas about what intelligence is and the centrality of human intelligence. And it was the really the coming together of those two things. Um, on the one hand, the emergence of things that are starting to look quite seriously like intelligence in machines, though that's
Mhm.
highly questionable and debatable what that actually means. And at the
Mhm.
same time,
Mhm.
this growing awareness of intelligence being something not unique to humans, and in fact something quite different again to how we commonly think about it. And I wanted to bring those things together, and in order to do so, it meant I had to think and understand a lot more about intelligence itself. And so that was how I originally framed the book and what a lot of the book is about. Though perhaps we can talk about this. It's not necessarily what I came to realize as being the most important thing.
Can you tell? That's exactly what my next question was going to be, because I think, I mean, the book is about intel. There is that sort of strand there, and you sort of identify very early two sort of theses that I think kind of spread across the range of research that you do in the book. One is that our ideas of computational intelligence are actually very limiting. Um, and that to me read very much as a continuation of thinking you were doing in your last book, New Dark Age. But then this other idea is that often what we mean when we talk about intelligence is just the things that humans do, the way that humans think. Can you sort of talk about how those insights helped evolve this book and sort of what it became?
Again, a bit like my previous answer, there's kind of two forks to that kind of came together to produce this work. Um, the first of which is that I set out to write a book about intelligence, promised my publisher I'd do that, wanted to do that, and so I realized at some point I would have to be quite clear about what I meant when I was talking about intelligence. So I read loads of other stuff about intelligence, expecting to helpfully find in there some useful, solid, simple definition of what intelligence is, and that doesn't actually really exist. Um,
Right.
there's lots of qualities really that come up when we talk about intelligence, things like making plans, having memories, kind of complex problem solving, um, also things like theory of mind, which is the ability to conceptualize
Mhm.
like the individuality and intelligence of others, or just the conceptualization of the self, which I talk about in the book quite a lot as the mirror test.
Right.
So there's all these different qualities, and most definitions of intelligence really are a kind of grab bag of these things, but there's no settled kind of single metric or definition. And the result of that, they're connected, is that most of the time when people talk about intelligence, they really just mean what people do. And so everything else kind of gets measured on that yardstick. It's why our main obsession with AI is the production of what commonly gets called like artificial general intelligence, i.e., an intelligence that's like a human. Um, Kind of fully intelligent AI is always conceptualized as basically human level, or of course superhuman in some way. And
Mhm.
also, it really colors our thinking about other beings, everything else we share the planet with, which we spend our whole time testing to see how much it is like the human in various ways. And as a result, we miss out on so much that's actually interesting and useful and important about it. Um, and the second part of that is that you know thinking about all these multiple forms of intelligence and ways of thinking about intelligence and potential metrics or qualities of intelligence, it really became clear how limited actually existing AI is. Like the programs mostly
Mhm.
things like machine learning and which are really just really really complicated computer programs. There's not very much that's intelligent about them unless you believe,
Right.
as I kind of came to do, that intelligence is really in the doing of it, um, which
Right.
maybe we can get into. But it became really startlingly obvious looking at a whole range of actual applications of AI in society and the world at large at present, that they represent a very narrow idea of what intelligence is, which in the book I call corporate intelligence. Which is an
Right.
intelligence that's completely obsessed with kind of profit and loss, winning and losing, dominating its own narrow field in order to produce quite a narrow definition of what counts as success within that field. It basically reduces anything really to a
Right,
kind of
right.
game to be won or a problem to be solved, preferably at kind of maximum profit and at maximum kind of superiority and domination. And that basically, is the kind of way that corporations think, or that, very wealthy or very business orientated people think. But it's a very, very narrow way of thinking indeed. But it is the way in which we are building most software and most things that we call AI as software in the present moment, which just seem to me to be, again, just like an incredible lack of imagination about what it could be.
I want to go back to this idea of intelligence as doing, and sort of the relationships here. And so, what you do in the book is you sort of look at all of these natural forms of intelligence: trees, birds, animals, plants. And there's this word that comes up again in the book, the German word Umwelt. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and how that sort of is helped shape a lot of this new understanding of intelligence that you start to lay out in the book.
Yeah, so the Umwelt is not the same as intelligence. It's better sort of thought of as a kind of world view or a perception or an awareness of the world. But what's key about it is that, you can apply it in all of these extraordinary complex ways. The guy who kind of coined the term, Jakob von Uxküll, um, and several of his kind of followers use the most common example of the kind of most simple form of this is that of a tick, as in like the small biting insect. Um,
Right,
but
right,
the tick has, I think it's three senses essentially. Um, its entire perception of the world is composed out of these three things, which is the smell of butyric acid, which is the kind of pheromone or chemicals given off by basically warm-blooded animals. Um, the temperature of blood. It can sense temperature in a very limited
right.
range, but mostly the temperature of warm-blooded animals. Um, and it can feel, in limited ways, particularly in ways that allow it to navigate around kind of skin, grasses, hairs, that kind of stuff. Right. So it has these incredibly three narrow things of smell, touch, and temperature range. Um, but out of that, its whole world blooms, right? That's its entire conception of the world. That is its Umwelt. Its own particular perspective on the world that gives it its entire awareness and allows it to live its particular life world. Um, but the thing
Right.
about the Umwelt is it's unique to every single individual, because it's also influenced by your particular environment and by your experiences and so on and so forth. And it also, particularly, it overlaps, right? And when I get very interested, is the point at which that tiny tiny Umwelt, which you can give to anything, right? Plants have an Umwelt. They sense the sun, they sense the
Right,
moisture of
right.
soil around them. Animals have it in all these various forms. You can think about it as a way not to understand what it is like to be a bat, for example, which is a famous essay by Thomas Nagel, in which he you know, tries to imagine what it'd
Right.
be like to be another creature. It's not about imagining what it was like to be another creature, but acknowledging that there is something that it is like to be that creature. Right? It has an awareness. It has
Hmm.
a perspective on the world. It has a being in the world. Um, and once you start to think about it as everything as having these umbrellas, everything having its own beinghood, that changes for me our relationships with them totally, because you can start to imagine them as their own separate beings who share a world with us, and with whom, at some level, we can engage with or imagine ourselves engaging with. One of the ways in which I use the term Umwelt, that actually kind of how I started using it before I kind of started thinking about non-human creatures of various kinds, was that I applied it to technology. Um, in particular, I was doing a project around self-driving cars, where I was essentially attempting to build my own self-driving car. Um, Not the full thing, but kind of all the sensors and software that would go into one. And the result of that was I started to understand, what is the Umwelt of this machine, because it has
Hmm.
sensors. Like, it sees the world through various cameras and sensors, both kind of, optical cameras, but also lidar, kind of range finding, point cloudy type stuff. Um, and also, it knows how fast it's moving. It knows where it is, um, and it's building a sense of its own environment from the information it's constructing from its cameras and maps and so on and so forth. So the self-driving car, this piece of technology, has an Umwelt. And thinking about how it has
Right.
an unveil allowed me to do some things that I didn't really expect when I started out on that project, which was to interact with it in unexpected ways. One of the things that I did as a result of that project was that I designed a thing that I call, half jokingly, the autonomous trap, which was a trap for a
Right.
self-driving car, which involved surrounding it with a solid line and then a dashed line, like road markings that produce a no entry symbol, but a no entry road marking that's looped all the way around the car so that once it enters, it can't leave. Which is kind of a mean thing to do, but it was actually specifically about finding this point of overlap in our own umvelts. Because as an artist, I wanted to be able to show people what I was doing, so I needed to make something that was visually accessible to humans and also to the machine. And so this dash and solid line is a point at which our umvelts overlap, and so it's a point at which we can interact and have relations.
What was really striking to me about the book, and especially after uh, reading New Dark Age, your previous book, and every interview that I listened to you and preparing for this, the interviewer said the same thing. And so I know you've heard this before, how grim New Dark Age is. And then, Ways of Being is a much more optimistic book, but not in a naive way at all. And what struck me about it is that it was not Ludditism at all. It was not a turning away from these things, but a sense of how can we reinvent them? How can we coexist with both the more than human world and this technological world? And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. How did thinking about Umwelt, how did thinking about these more than human intelligences change your own relationship to technology, to what we culturally call artificial intelligence?
Well, there's the first thing is, yeah, the New Dark Age is a pretty bleak book, and I always say as well that when I before I wrote that, I always really wanted to write a book about the internet. Like, I always thought I'd write a book about the internet, and I always thought it would be a book about how great the internet is. But I started writing that book between Brexit and the Trump election, and it was very clear in that moment that
Right,
that was not the thing to write or a useful thing to think at that particular point in time. And so, what New
right.
Dark Age became was an attempt at an accounting for where we were, just a solid, clear-eyed statement of the place that we were in, and the ways in which our technologies were interacting with the world around us and with us, and what was being produced as a result of that, with also a very clear intention to not try and produce solutions for this, or not to come up with like the
Right.
smart answers to it. um, that wasn't what I was trying to do, and in fact I think that the desire to do that is part of the problem. That was kind of part of the New
Mm-hmm.
Dark Age theory as well. um, but and so I did that, and I wrote a grim book, um, and
A great book, by the way. Like, I
thank you.
really loved the book,
I
but it
mean, I'm
was it
very
was
fond of
heavy.
it as well, but I know it's not an easy read. Um, uh, but following it, having done that, not just for readers, but really for myself, I had to think about, okay,
Right.
well, what follows this? Like, how do you think beyond this? Again, not trying to look for solutions, just trying to be clear-eyed about where we are and to think what is the next thing to kind of look for. And I didn't go about that directly, as I say, as a kind of solutions-based thing, but at the same time, well, also one of the things in New Dark Age that became very clear to me, and I think to a lot of resonated with a lot of readers as well, was the climate aspects of the technological
Mm-hmm.
situation.
Mm-hmm.
For that book, only a very small amount of which I actually put into the book, I learned a lot more about the climate than I already did, and that's not a fun thing to do in the present moment. And so
Right.
it reiterated in me a desire to work on climate related research and work. And so in the last few years,
Mm.
I've reoriented the whole of my practice, not just my writing, around the environment and ecological issues. Um, but I
Mm.
wanted to bring to that, what I knew already. I think I maybe know a few things about technology in the world that might be applicable here, and not approaching it as a kind of complete newbie, or as a kind of terra nullius. Um, and so I've been trying to think of ways in which to accommodate the technology with ecological thinking, and the result is Ways of Being and various other bits of work. Um,
Mm.
uh, and that has been very powerful to me, in the sense that writing New Dark Age depressed me, I can assure you, more than any of the readers. um, and and particularly put me into a state that I now recognise as that is being recognised, I think, more broadly, as what people are calling climate trauma, which is the sense of really quite serious depression and helplessness that we can find ourselves in when we start to consider the situation that we're in.
Right.
But doing this work and writing this book was also my way of working through that trauma, not to resolve it, but to be able to integrate it and make it useful and work with it in some way. Um, and the final part is also that there's resonances that I only really realized after sometime after completing Ways of Being. Um, the main one of which is a concept that crops up very strongly in both books, which is essentially dealing with the unknown. One of the things I talk about in New Dark
Mm-hmm.
Age a lot is the fact that when dealing with contemporary complex networked technologies, we are often in a situation in which we do not and cannot know the full ramifications of the situation we're in, and that can be a really terrifying and destabilizing thing.
Right.
And it's one of the main kind of effects of modern complex technology, uh, and our civilization at large, not just from technology as well, but it's a major driver of that. Um, but in Ways of Being, I realized I'd found a larger, more interesting, more fulfilling and generative way to talk about and think about the unknown, as the unknown is something that exists outside ourselves as individual humans or even as a species, but is nevertheless alive and living in the world, and something that we can look to if we don't try to understand it in the same kind of dominating solutions based way that I looked at technology in the last book, but simply as a force around us in the world that is living and vital and powerful, that is unknowable to us, and that's okay, because it's something that we can talk to and listen to as well.
I want to use that to sort of connect this to my work and my background in design for a second. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. I know you're not a designer, but I think so much of your work is design adjacent.
I have
Um,
been adjacent to many designers as well.
right, that's right. You mentioned earlier this idea that a lot of what we call artificial intelligence is really just a kind of corporate intelligence. It's a sort of capitalistic, dominating, solutions-based, profiteering sort of mode, of thinking, and that really resonated with me because I've been thinking and talking a lot about with my students and with colleagues about this idea of human-centered design and the problems with this notion of human-centered design. And one of the things I've been saying is that maybe there's no such thing as human-centered design. What we call human-centered design is actually corporation-centered design. It's really a way. It's not how to make something as easy as possible for the user. It's how to make something as easy as possible for the user in service of buying a product, more their attention. All of these other things. If Facebook was using human-centered design, then it would be designed so people wouldn't be using Facebook. You know what I mean? And the second part of that is that does human-centered design overlook all the more than human aspects? Should we actually be thinking about ecology-centered design, for example, or climate-centered design, or multi-generational centered design, or something? And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on all of this thinking and work you've done in a design context, and if any of this sort of resonates with you.
Yeah, I mean, it resonates with me hugely, but I'm not sure I can express it much better than you've just done. Um,
Okay,
I
okay.
definitely agree with you that the discipline of human-centered design, when it's performed, for a corporate product, then ultimately the goal of that design is not to produce the best outcomes for the humans. It's to produce the best outcomes for the product. But that's it's probably a bit of a stretch to say that that's what human-centered design is at any point claiming to do. It is making it easier for
Right.
humans to do a particular task, rather than the engineers or the designers. But it's not. I don't think it necessarily makes any loftier claims than that, which is not to say that we shouldn't try for loftier claims, because yeah, as you very well put it, most of the things that most of the products we use all the time are designed to make certain parts of human lives easier. And there's always a cost to that in some level. There's a huge cost to us most of
Right.
the time. I mean, most of the stories I tell in New Dark Age are stories of how um, things are hidden within software systems to make them easier,
Right.
apparently, in certain ways, while externalizing or obscuring, the costs of them. The classic example of this is kind of gig economy ordering apps,
Right.
where
Right.
just pressing that little button on your screen sets in motion all these other humans whose labor and lives you don't have to think about. It just hides all of that
Right.
stuff away. And so that's obviously easier for the one particular human at the center of it, and probably for whoever's getting the money from the app, but is not centered around the lives of everybody else who's affected by it. But when you start to think more broadly, then you have to start thinking about the lives of really everyone who's involved in that, which includes non-humans. So you have to start thinking about, for example, the energy costs of the app you're
Right.
designing. What are the choices you've made within a piece of software, for example, that actually have these massive external costs. I've just for myself, I've become annoyingly aware of this, to the point where it's affected even the tiny bits of design that I do. A really simple example is
Right.
looking at building a website recently, and I made like a really cool animation for the background
Right.
of the
Right.
thing, and then was like, well, actually, that's just like hyped my CPU use, which means my machine and any machine that accesses this and the servers are going to be using more power,
Yeah.
and and therefore requiring more electricity generation, blah blah blah, which results in more CO2 emissions, blah blah blah. Like, can I justify having that cool animation? No. Um, and now, obviously, the world isn't
Right.
going to be saved if we all stop doing cool animations. But there is a really fascinating, growing, you know, um, design methodologies around low energy use,
Yeah.
reducing all of these costs as much as we can. And a truly ecologically centered design would follow as much of those principles as possible, because we should be using less energy. And when you think in those terms, when that's the number one priority, that of course changes your whole kind of design stack. Or your whole
Right.
process, because you have to really rethink where the costs of what you're doing actually accrue, and can you justify them. And it's pretty much immediately obvious that you can't for a lot of things, and so that really changes everything.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. That's such a great example. I can't tell you how many times I've been in that same position, where it's like, oh, I should just cut out all these lines of code in this website because
Uh,
this
I,
would
I,
save
I
it.
th- I think it's also worth pointing out that but many of those do accord with principles of human centric design, and also with accessibility.
Right,
That actually they
right,
also have a whole
right.
bunch of benefits, because a really key point about ecological centered design, if we can call it that, but also ecological thinking in general, is that this is not a zero-sum game in which we just basically cut
Right.
benefits for humans, but therefore it's okay or a bit better or slightly better for someone else, or something else somewhere else.
Right.
But actually, that the benefits accrue to everybody when ecological relations are taken as the first and most important, point of any design or thinking.
And I think that goes back to this idea that this isn't Ludditism. This isn't like anti-design in some way, but it's sort of rethinking that relationship um, in a more than human context. You talking about the website animation, I first started following your work and was aware of your work probably 11 years ago, when you were sort of working under what you were calling the new aesthetic. You were doing the Dronestagram and kind of a lot of infrastructural type work. And so I came to your work first and for a long time purely through your visual art, your installations, those projects. Um, but you have been writing through that whole period, and it seems to me that writing has become much more central in your practice, or at least the production of books, perhaps. And I'm curious about the intersection of the writing and the art making. And I don't mean to make too much of a separation there, but I'm wondering how those sort of come together as research, as prototyping. You mentioned the self-driving cars, a sort of key insight. How do you see this process of sort of art making and writing fitting together for you?
I mean, as you say, and it's a boring answer, but for me, they just really aren't that separate. Like, I've always written, and I've also always wanted to be a writer, and I'd be very happy just doing that, frankly. But
Mm,
I always say that, and then I have to do the big but, which is that a lot of the ideas come out of other aspects, out of making something
that
that
was my next
spurs a
question.
thought,
Yeah.
or giving a
Okay.
talk as well, which is a big part of my practice, which I don't write for quite often. Most of my talks
Ah,
are they're not scripted, and so I'll find myself saying something on stage that I didn't expect, which is
right.
because you're activating different bits of the brain. And I think that's probably the key bit there, that doing different tasks, whether that's writing language, whether it's writing code, which is an entirely different practice, whether
Right.
it's
Right.
whether it's building a box, or a tool, a practical physical thing, or whether it's trying to do something visually, um, that you activate different bits of the brain and different things fall into place as a result. And um and that's always just how I've worked, that the images and words kind of accompany themselves, though for me writing is always somewhat central, in the fact that I always end up writing
Right.
like some huge essay about something that's supposed to be a visual artwork, because one aspect of it is always insufficient for me. I have huge admiration for artists who don't do that, and there's no requirement on artists to do that at all. And it's one of the great things about visual art is that it escapes language in various ways, but it's not really what I do. Um, yeah, that's just how I tend to go about it. Um, and as an addendum to that, for me, the practical qualities are really, really important. So much of my knowledge, as I understand it, is gained from actually making or doing things, not just writing about them. And that's, for example, that's totally crucial to my technological thinking, in that I
Yeah.
I don't I don't think I could write or should write about technology in the way that I do, were I not engaged in trying occasionally and very badly to actually make it.
Ah,
Um,
right.
because
Right.
unless you do that, you don't understand how it works. And that's really fundamental.
Right.
Like, unless you can make something yourself, you have a very limited understanding of how it functions. And this extends to everything. I'm currently doing a lot more physical stuff in the last couple of years, by which I
Mm,
mean building stuff, from like small regenerative energy tools and toys all the way up to building buildings. And that totally changes my relationship to the things around me, and therefore changes my thinking, both in what I understand to be
right.
possible,
Right.
but also how those things shape me and the world around me.
This is probably also, you said that was going to be a boring answer. I actually don't think it was, and so this might also be a boring answer. But can you talk a little bit more about this idea of like what is sort of driving the ideas? You're reading and writing about these ideas, and then you feel like you have to sort of enact this or embody this through the art making, or are you sort of making these physical structures and then thinking, oh, I need to write it, there's an idea here that I can write about. How does that sort of exchange happen?
Yeah, I mean,
Can you talk about that just a little bit more?
it's
I
deeply
know it's like
cyclical,
hard
and it's
to.
the boring but not answer is always, it's just where my curiosity takes me, but it's not just me, it's the world. you know um I
Right.
wanted to write that book about the internet, and I've always wanted to write about the internet because I love the internet, because I grew up with the internet, because I was born in 1980, and like, the internet and me were adolescents at the
Right.
same time through the 90s. And I have this kind of particular experience of it because of my age and my socioeconomic position and various other things that made it a part of my life, that I also wanted to engage with as more than just a viewer or
Hmm.
receiver. And it's probably that bit
Hmm.
of like,
Hmm.
just wanting to understand and know more about these things so I could do interesting things with them myself. I think that's really the
Right.
key. And for me, all of that comes out of you know an internet history, basically, in terms of the fact that
Yeah.
you know the internet that I grew up with was this amazing kind of patchwork tool where you could view source on any web page and copy and
Yep.
bits out of it and build your own. And that was a very natural way to behave on the early internet, which is, without being old man
Yeah.
shouting at clouds, has largely disappeared, um, as it's become a kind of both a corporate product and a kind of specialized professional discipline.
Totally.
Um,
Yep.
but I apply that to kind of everything. But also now as a result of a conscious kind of thesis, which is that, we, in order to have any kind of agency in a complex world defined by the things that we build, or mostly by the things that others build, we have to be able to interact with them as more than kind of passive receivers of them. Um, and so much of my work is not about building or doing a thing because I want to do it professionally, or even because I want to produce a better version of it, or because I think I'll come up with some magic solution or better version of it, but simply because knowing how a thing works gives me a kind of standing in the world, um, that allows me to do more, do other things. There's the word that comes up in both books a lot is agency, and agency is simply the feeling that one knows what is going on in one's life, that one has some
Right.
say in what happens in one's life, and that you're capable of kind of making decisions that matter about one's life. Um,
Right.
and
Right.
most of us lack that in most of our lives, for a bunch of reasons. But it's particularly apparent when you confront new technology or when you confront the climate emergency. You really become aware of where your level of agency is, and the first result of that is, long before we talk about taking action, it's about regaining this sense of agency, which is really a psychological thing that is so important, an absolutely necessary precursor to any meaningful action. And most of what I do for myself, and hopefully for others in kind of workshops or collective work, is building agency, which is largely building skills, but not necessarily the skills that you will employ in future action, but just the psychological basis on which to be able to act, um, and a place to be able to hope from, I think, as well. Not really being interested in just a kind of naive optimism, but building a base on
Right.
which one can actually build plausible hope.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and it actually strangely really helps me understand your work more broadly. A word that I wrote down in my notes and thinking about you and this conversation was infrastructure, and that so much of your work is about exposing the infrastructure, making us aware of the infrastructure of the systems that sort of govern so much of our lives. And I think the step after exposing the infrastructure is agency.
Yeah,
Once you
absolutely.
sort of see that, it gives you that agency. I have one more sort of question about the kind of your art
Hmm.
making. um Something that I really admire in your work is the range of mediums that you work in. You do installations, you do videos, you write books, you do sort of digital coding projects. You did a great audio series for the BBC. How does sort of working across mediums help you understand these things in different ways, or how do you sort of think about the artifact or the outcome or the medium of this research?
Well, I mean, I think maybe I sort of answered that already when I was talking about the fact that for me these are all just aspects of the same like processes. But I think the broader point maybe is that, is about this ability to learn them. That is as part of
Mm,
agency, part of much else. Um, there's a absolutely classic Ursula K. Le Guin quote which crops up in Ways of Being, and which I base much of my life on, um, which comes from a short piece she wrote about, the nature of technology, um, in which she describes, technology as the like human interface with the world. It's the stuff we build in order to interface with the world, which is a fairly good solid standard definition. But being Ursula Le Guin, she takes that substantially further, which is what she does. She points out that like all of these things are products. They were all made by people. Um, that's the other
mhm.
definition of technology: made stuff made by people, and all of those people learned how to do it. Um, and actually, that's what technology is. It's something that we can learn to do, um, and it doesn't matter what it is.
Mm,
Like, obviously, I'm massively privileged in a bunch of ways that I have, a certain background, and a certain I live in a certain part of the world and I've arranged my life in certain ways, and I've been very lucky in all the ways I managed to do that in order to be able to do the things I do. But I fundamentally believe that given the right opportunities, anyone can learn to do what I do
Right.
because I've learned to do it. And this goes all the way back to, like,
Right.
coding projects. I'm a terrible coder. Like I know like half of like
Yeah.
3 or 4 programming languages, and most of what I make is made by copying and pasting stuff off the web still, which frankly is how most coders do it. But I do understand how it works, because I have learned. And it's the same, like I'm a terrible carpenter. But I've built quite large structures. Um, and I can and
Yeah.
I've,
Yeah.
like, from scratch. One of my real heroes is a guy called Walter Siegel, um, who was
Oh yeah.
a German architect living in Britain in the kind of 1930s, 40s, 50s. And Siegel developed a mode of self-build housing that was designed specifically for people with no experience of carpentry whatsoever. He said of it that anyone can
Mm.
do this. If you can drill a hole and cut in a straight line, you can do this. And I can't even cut in a straight line, and I can do it. And what he saw in particular was that there were a lot of people in the UK at the time in the 1970s on social housing waiting lists. So they were waiting for state given accommodation, long
Mm.
waiting list for this. And there was also a bottleneck in housing building that was, dominated by large corporate house builders who would only build on particular sites and blah, blah, blah. So basically, he went to his local council and said, look, I can teach anyone to build a house if you give us some land. And he persuaded the council to give them some land in South
Mm.
London in the 1970s. And a bunch of people built houses. And they built them themselves for themselves with no experience. Famously, and in spare time from their regular jobs, like single parents did this, retired people did this, um, and his methodology was designed, as I say, for people without. He took that into account, so it's based on a particular um, kind of framework for building that's based on a modular grid, that's based on the standard sizes of things
Ah.
like insulation panels, so you don't need to do a lot of cutting on site. You
Right.
just put everything in the right place,
Right.
and
Right.
produces a really simplified planning process that anyone can follow. And you can do it. You can learn to build a house. Not just learn to build a house, you can build a house. Anyone can build a house. um
I love that.
but a lot of thought went into producing a method that not just worked, but that was kind of teachable and that fitted into people's lives and that was understandable by people, you know. Um, and that's really, powerful and fascinating to me. The absolute belief that anyone can learn to do this. Um, that these are not skills. They're just not skills that one can't learn. That's the definition of a skill as
Right.
well as a technology. It's something you can develop. Um, and that
Right.
and that's still central to all of my work. That there's only 2 or 3 things I've made, and I really dislike them intensely for this as artworks, where I don't feel like I really made it because I worked with someone else and they did bits that I couldn't do, I
Ah.
didn't understand, and as a result, I understood less at the end, right? And this happened particularly with a couple of AI projects where I basically hired people to do the AI bit,
Oh, interesting.
and as a result, the projects weren't very good, because I couldn't bring the kind of critical thinking that I hope I bring to my other projects because I didn't really understand what was going on. It's the old art, great artists mix their own paint argument, which unless you're conversant in your materials, you don't understand what the possibilities of them are. But anyone can learn to do it.
I listened to a conversation you had with Clara Evans to prepare for this, and you mentioned at the beginning of that, just very briefly, that you were writing some more fiction or that you were interested in writing fiction. And I'm curious, A, how that is going,
Huh.
and sort of how you're thinking about that. And then also what fiction can do in this space that this other work that you're doing maybe cannot, or kind of the power of fiction in a way that, journalism or criticism, maybe can't do.
Well, I'll start by saying that fiction is something that I'm trying to learn how to do and not very well,
Right.
and I'm not very happy with any
Yeah.
of my efforts so far. Uh,
Okay.
and it's really something that I struggle with a lot. I don't know how to do plot or characterization or or
Right,
or, or,
right,
or
right, right.
speech, and so I mostly end up with like single characters having internal monologues and not going anywhere, which doesn't
Yeah,
really amount to
yeah.
good fiction. Um, but I've always been a huge fiction reader and a fiction lover, so it's a thing I want to learn how to do. Um, so why do I
Right.
want to learn to do it? Which is the interesting question. Um, it's really surprising to me because I have a lot of I have a lot of problems with fiction, particularly in design, in fact, because
Mm,
one of the design scenes I've been around a lot is what's commonly known as design fiction,
right.
um, which has a lot of problems, attached to it. It has some really wonderful stuff as well. I think there's so many good ideas in there, but as it's expanded, it's also kind of infected a lot of stuff with the natural tendency within a lot of
Yep.
design to
Yep.
make stuff that looks cool, essentially. And that's just what happens. And I don't want to bash anyone or anything in particular for it, but I distrust it.
I get it.
And I particularly distrust its quality of uh, it's sort of innate belief that if you make something, it will make the future it describes more attractive. Even though a lot of design fiction and other things like
Mm,
this tend to be a little, and science fiction in general tends to be a little dystopic. Um,
right.
Even it's utopian best. It implies that like by we can sort of design our way into a future by imagining what that future will be
Yeah.
like, and
Yeah.
sort of this kind of strange
Yeah.
attractor effect will kind of pull us towards it. And I think maybe it actually does the opposite.
Right.
It kind of forecloses certain futures. All of which is to say, like, in my work, I always try to avoid like prognostication, prediction,
Yep.
and anything really future oriented. Like, I really always try and talk about the present and the situation that we're actually in. Um, but I have a project that came out of Ways of Being that's called Server Farm, which is a,
Oh
a,
yeah.
a
Yeah.
project where I'm trying to think what it would be look like to put a bunch of those ideas into practice. It's particularly ideas around non-digital biological computation, and also
Mm,
political ideas about different relations between humans and non-humans, and what more equal relationships between species and beings would actually look like. So what would it
mm,
mean to
mhm,
build a
mhm.
biological computer, like some kind of computational thing with
Right.
other beings, both as the structure of that computation, but also as beings that are worthy of kind of care and respect and have their own agency, and so on and so forth. And that's a really interesting and very nascent and very long-term project. But one of the first things I found myself doing about
Yeah.
it was writing speculative science fiction about it, which I really didn't expect because it
Oh,
goes
interesting.
against all of those principles. Um, yeah, it made a kind of sense because it was a way of a different way of thinking about what this thing might be and what it might look like, and using certain, again, I'll just use to say, different areas of the brain, like the imagination, in
Right.
as a tool in exactly the same way I would use a spade, like just to dig out a different
Right.
aspect of
Right.
this thing. Um, it's really not about trying to predict, but really just trying to use the full spectrum of tools to bring a thing into
Yeah.
being. And some of
Yeah.
that is narrative, and
Yeah.
some of it is, um, imagining it in different contexts, and that might be a different context in time. In order to just have as many possible viewpoints on this thing in order to understand it better.
It leads in very nicely to the last question that I used to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
At the moment, I'm reading a whole bunch of really great stuff. I'm reading about 10 books at once. I'm in a real like mental like
Nice. Nice.
accumulation
I love it.
phase. The book I have right in front of me right now, so I'll just give it because I'm loving it so much, is Alexis Pauline Gumb's Undrowned: Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, um, where she writes this kind of series of meditations about other relationships we might have with other beings, specifically marine mammals, talking simply
Mm,
about, how they breathe, how they live in the world, and what we might learn from it in a really beautiful way that
mm.
manages to avoid a large amount of the kind of anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism that usually enters these debates, while retaining what's important, which is love and care. Um, I'm
Mhm.
also reading a brilliant book called Pollution is Colonialism. And I don't have the author's name in front of me, so your listeners will have to Google it. But it's called Pollution is Colonialism, which is a book about plastics and pollution, but ties them into questions of social justice and land relations and relationships in general
Mm,
that I'm finding to be incredibly fascinating and powerful. Just like how we think about the materials we use, what their actual effects are,
mhm.
and how we write about them as well, because a lot of the book is about the nature of citation and who we give credence and
Oh,
credit to,
interesting.
and how our ideas are constructed largely upon who we're thankful to, which I think is a very powerful notion. Um, So I'm reading a lot of stuff that's like that sort of theory in these worlds of ecology, and I find that to be very powerful and interesting because it's practical theory. It's not just kind of the ideas. It's like, how do we actually use these and think about these? Um, and I'm also reading a lot of books about environmental and ecological history to see how we got here. I just finished a great book called Imperial Mud, which is about the enclosure
Mm.
of the fens in England, which is where between the kind of 15th and 18th century, large areas of wetland were were dried out rather, to make agricultural farmland, which involved the destruction of huge communities, but also the loss of incredible areas of biodiversity, um, and were also precursors to British colonialism elsewhere. So these things are always deeply, deeply interrelated, and I'm trying to learn more about that at the moment.
Your book is called Ways of Being: Animals, Plants, Machines: The Search for Planetary Intelligence, and it is a book that will be rattling around in my brain for a long time, and I think will be I will be making sense of it for a long time and kind of finding new applications for it. It was such a great book, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
This episode was recorded on November 9th, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.